perhaps the most important distinction to keep in mind is that John of the Cross and the Carmelites have a very distinct definition of contemplative prayer, and that it's always a gift and always infused, indeed freely infused by God, and that you can't merit it, you can't earn it, etc. Now that's all very true, but the next question is, how do you get from where we are to that point? So there is a lot of excellent literature in the Christian tradition about getting started on the journey and what it's like when you've got to the end, but how you get from the point A to point B is not so clear. And this is really the point that centering prayer is addressing. And it's where its originality is, if it has any, and I think it probably has, although it's trying simply to be in the lineage and to reflect the uninterrupted tradition. But life changes and new circumstances occur, so I don't think it's against the tradition if you, as a result of experience, now 2,000 years old, you see that it's not just a question of beginning or end, but means, and this involves effort on our part. Now, the effort is really, I suppose, to convince you that nothing we do really works, so that we reach a point where there's no choice but to turn oneself over completely to God and to receive it as a gift. But while you're in this transitional period from a merely human way of relating to God to the grace that is pulling us into divine way, a divinely human way of relating to God, that is addressed by a method that is as simple as possible, but orientated towards contemplation, that is, towards a totally receptive disposition. Now, it seems to me that in the Eastern traditions, they work very hard at this through the practice of mindfulness, at least and this is very helpful, and there's a lot that you can do to quiet the mind and to focus it, and some can reach a point where they can control their thoughts almost completely. Centering prayer is not about attention or mindfulness in that sense. It's about, you might say, heartfulness. It's about the purity of intention and consent that prepares us more through an attitude of loving relationship than through the very real accomplishment of controlling the flow of thoughts, or the monkey mind, as the Buddhists rightly call it. So what centering prayer is a state that even one of the Carmelites, Ernie Larkin, has pointed out is not quite discursive prayer and not quite contemplation. And there hasn't really been, at least in his view, this intermediary stage, which is really a question of finding a way from point A to point B.
Yes.
And so the result is that in centering prayer, once the practice is established as a discipline, there are times when we have to work, but very gently. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the less effort, the better, as part of the method itself. So there's just an original intention to be in God's presence and consent to his presence in action, and then maintaining that consent when there are thoughts that pull us out of that intention, either by distraction or by attraction. So in the course of the discipline, one renews again and again one's original intention, but ever so gently. And then what happens then is, but using some sacred symbol to help you to do that, eventually you come to a point where you're aware that you're not interested in the thoughts. this is the point, it seems to me, that contemplative prayer actually begins as traditionally exposed by the Carmelites, as infused. Why aren't you interested in the usual thoughts that always interested you? Or why aren't you caught in particularly engaging or fascinating thought? The answer seems to be there's a secret presence within that is drawing you. We would say the Holy Spirit is exercising the attractive force. And the early fathers of the church had a whole metaphor, a set of metaphors for this, which they called the spiritual senses. So that this very subtle attraction, spiritual, is like, it's as if, it's not the same, but it's like a sensible attraction to the perfume of flowers. So it resonates with the great love poem in the Old Testament, the Song of Songs. Draw me, we will run after you in the sweet odors of your ointments. So it's the perfume is not necessarily seen, but it affects the nose rather than the eyes. And so you have this tendency to go after this delicious smell of roses and stick your nose in them if you could find them. You can't find them, but the attraction manifests itself in a disinterest in thinking of other things that you used to have interest in and that used to catch you and get the monkey mind jumping around among the trees in short order when you tried to be silent. And so this is the first experience of infused prayer. It's the attraction to interior peace, silence, freedom, joy, peace. It has many different shades of presence and interpretation. Well, this can get a little more intense. And I'm following here St. Teresa of Avila and her exposition in the interior castle. If the Spirit draws you a little tighter towards the center, towards this ground of being and beyond where the Holy Spirit is present, supporting us in existence and in a way that is loving, then one becomes aware of the divine attraction. In other words, the voltage sort of increases, or the warmth of the beloved gets a little hotter, and one wants to surrender to and it usually can be very blissful, but it's interrupted by thoughts that still come down the stream of consciousness because the will is not controlling the mind anymore. It's loving, and hence if it leaves the will to will love aspect, it will get caught on the intricacies of thinking and lose the experience. So there's a certain fear then that one is going to follow some thought. So it's not exactly a blissful experience because you're kind of struggling with your own uncontrolled thoughts and feelings at the same time. When it's strong, it's quite strong, and it can go on all day, actually, when it's as a result. But suppose the Spirit hugs the will just a little bit tighter. And in doing this, she calls this the prayer of union, in which the faculties of memory and imagination are temporarily suspended so that they can't think. So there's no memory, there's no future, there's just a very intense sense of now, but there is the awareness that one is in this state. So this, she thinks, is fairly brief. I don't know, half an hour, she thinks. Finally, suppose the Holy Spirit grasps the will completely. Then it doesn't know where it is. The soul has no self-awareness at all during that time. So this merging of total self-forgetfulness, so that one doesn't even know one was in such a state till after it's over and sees the effects of it, then one has no name for this. In other words, it's a total loss of self for the few moments. It may be very brief, but it changes the orientation of one's psyche substantially. So obviously, prayer for people experiencing these increased levels of penetrating the mystery within them is going to go by different names, because they're really talking about a different level of experience. But the place in between that centering prayer addresses is something like a no man's land, where our activity, very simplified, just to an offering of a sacred symbol of some kind, like a word or a glance or following the breath, or noticing the breath rather, are the three hallowed ways of traditionally doing the same thing, that is, learning to offer one's naked being to God. At the same time, the Spirit is coming towards us and drawing us by these attractiveness into deeper actual experiences of union with God, even to the extent of self-forgetfulness, which is the prayer in secret when it's completely secret. What could be more secret than if you don't know it? Well, you do know it after it's over, because you can see its effects. But it's this place that has not been identified too clearly in Christian tradition, the place where the Spirit and our activity are gently intermingling, so that sometimes it's our effort and sometimes it's pure Spirit that is working, and you don't know which is actually, and you don't need to.